Hey everyone, and welcome to my first year in review. It's something that I've always wanted to do, but never properly planned or prepared for, never having the time to piece together towards the year's end. This is a bit of an experiment for me, so let me know if you'd like me to keep doing it, or if you'd rather I just focus on regular videos. Note that I will not be going over news items from 2023. This is just a look back at the games that I played throughout the year. To that end, this is also going to be the highlights. While I won't be organizing these in some Game of the Year style order, there will be plenty of games I played that will not be mentioned. It's also possible that if a major game is missing, it's simply because I didn't play it. For some examples, though I was interested in Master Detective Archive's Rain Code, I didn't have the time to play it on release and still haven't really purchased it for myself. Final Fantasy XVI will also be missing, though mainly because I do not own a PS5 and don't really want one. I did try out games like Wolong Fallen Dynasty and Redfall on Game Pass, but completed neither and don't have strong feelings on them one way or the other. So with that out of the way, let's get to talking about the most interesting games I played in 2023, Part 1. It's interesting to see the similar yet different approaches both Capcom and EA's Motive Studio took when recreating two iconic action horror games. Both sought to be faithful to their original, but where EA Motive smoothed out the wrinkles and sought to present a game as accurate to your memory as possible, Capcom intentionally made adjustments and tweaks to remix that old experience while still preserving the same spirit and feel. The end result is one game that almost feels like a replacement for the original, while the other kind of stands beside it, neither better nor worse. So let's begin with Dead Space. If you hadn't played the original in years, then it almost feels like nothing has changed. So faithful is the attempt to recreate that experience that you may not even realize how much of an improvement the visuals and lighting are. The combat feels the same as you'd remember, most of the necromorphs behave the same as you remember, and even if an environment feels different at first, the layout will surely jog the memory and remind the player of precisely what room they're in. Having gone back to the original 2008 Dead Space briefly, however, it's fascinating to note how much more challenging and intimidating the environment in the remake is. Necromorphs were more fragile and fewer in number in some of those earlier chambers in the original game, and the new lighting engine really plays tricks with the mind in ways the original game couldn't. Of course, there are other adjustments to the Ishimura, the planet-cracking vessel in which the game takes place, that help smooth out level design and tie the different sectors together more seamlessly. The zero-gravity controls are also in alignment with the sequels, offering fully free maneuverability to float around and explore or fight. Some story beats were also improved upon while reimagining some of the more frustrating portions of the game. I can't really say the original Dead Space has been made obsolete, as there will always be historical value to it, but I can't really think of any reason to recommend it over this new remake. Everything that worked has been preserved, the controls have been touched up a bit, wrinkles smoothed out, and any weaknesses have been remixed or improved to deliver a superior version true to the original vision. Honestly, if you're going to remake a game that's already good, this is the manner in which I typically prefer you do it. Which is what makes the Resident Evil 4 remake so much more difficult to discuss. I don't know how in depth I want to get, as I've been trying on and off to make a video about the original for over a year now, and I feel like there's even more to say now that the remake is out. If only I could, buckle down and get it done. Still, while on paper, the Dead Space remake is my preferred way of going about a recreation of a good product, it still is not as good of a game as the Resident Evil 4 remake, which is no surprise as the original 2008 release of Dead Space was inferior to the original Resident Evil 4 as well. As good as Dead Space always was, it failed to capture the same sense of freedom, resourcefulness, and intensity that Resident Evil 4 had completely mastered, and the remake has held true to that philosophy and more. The combat, arena, and AI design are all just as impeccable and head of the class as they were back in 2005. Despite the number of quality of life adjustments to movement and controls to more modernize the game, Capcom was still careful in how the Ganados and cultists behaved, the manner in which they'd flank Leon, and the number of ways in which they could react not just to Leon's strikes, but to the environment itself. Whereas Dead Space was so close to the original it felt just like the original, Resident Evil 4 controls and plays differently from the original, while the spirit and philosophy it's designed means you can jump in and feel like you're playing that same familiar game, just with some new abilities. Some tactics and strategies carry over while others do not, but so long as you play with the same tactical mindset and approach as the original, you're bound to feel right at home. Honestly, I was surprised to find the remake fit like a familiar and snug glove when I played. So what's the problem? Why would I ever go back and replay the original Resident Evil 4 if the combat to the remake is so good, yet I can't imagine replaying the original Dead Space? For starters, they wanted to make Ashley so much more player-friendly that there's really not much to her, mechanically speaking at least. I have a theory that the only reason you'd find Ashley to be troublesome in the original Resident Evil 4 is if you wanted to play as if she weren't there. Telling her when to stand still or follow made a more notable tactical difference back then than telling her how near or far to keep her in the remake, and I never once found any benefit in having her keep a distance from me. This made her barely a consideration, and removing her health bar actually made her a great annoyance at parts to me than if she did have a health bar. Mechanically, Ashley is honestly just a downgrade, but if you want to play like she doesn't exist, then I guess she's an improvement for you. My other gripes largely come in regards to how they modified some of the characters and the efforts to remove the cheese from Resident Evil 4. I mean, Leon was honestly the best protagonist of the whole franchise because, in Resident Evil 4 original at least, he was the only one not taking everything so seriously. Yeah, he still has quips here and there in the remake, but he's just as overly serious as everyone else, which removes much of the joy that set the original apart. Sadler and Ada are by far inferior interpretations of their original counterparts, nearly leaving the entire game to be a lifeless husk narratively. The only things I would say I like are the interpretations of Lewis, making him more of a character than before while still retaining his comedic nature, and the character of Ashley who, well, she feels like a real 19-year-old girl. I felt she was fine in the original as well, but here, she really does fit the game's new tone, and the chapter in which she's by herself is suitably nerve-wracking and intense, and the actress did a great job bringing her to life.
Just say I was done. This sucks!
Side by side, the Resident Evil 4 remake is the better game to the Dead Space remake, just as they had been years ago. But as far as remakes go, I think I like the approach Dead Space took better, if only because the Resident Evil 4 remake sacrificed so much of the charm, and for what? To be more in line with the other prestigious AAA games out there? Not a sacrifice worth making. Still, both titles were a strong way to start 2023 off, that's for sure. I don't often play a lot of indie games, in part because most of them are missing some degree of appeal or, as cruel as it sounds to say if such low budget or small team works, polish. But I have a weak spot for pixel art retro-inspired games evoking the feel and energy of the Super Nintendo, though I also want them to feel like an evolution of that era, as if gaming never moved to 3D and continued on its pixel art path. If the game looks like a Super Nintendo game but feels inferior to the best in class from that time, then I am unlikely to really enjoy it. I also am not drawn to games that emphasize atmosphere or artistic presentation over mechanics. There ends up being a lot of well-loved indies I miss because they look interesting, but not interesting enough to really grip me. 2023 has been surprising in that it has not only offered several titles that speak to my picky desires, but more than I could make time for. Leading the charge of this year's selections is Inti Creates, with their release of Gal Guardian's Demon Purge. Beware to those unfamiliar with the franchise this game is spun off from, the Gal Gun series, as Demon Purge is not unlike a Trojan horse. It seems like a relatively innocent, side-scrolling Castlevania-style game about two demon-hunting sisters, but it slowly descends into anime weeb degeneracy. I mean, tolerance levels may vary, and for some this is hardly a puddle compared to the ocean of otaku depravity. I know I have certainly seen worse. Regardless, it doesn't change the game from being a pretty solid pixel art action romp. The primary gripe one might have is in how much repetition is baked into the experience. Gal Guardians expects 2 or 3 runs through each of its 8 stages if you want anything even resembling a credits rolling conclusion. Of course, you won't have all of your sub-weapons on your initial run, meaning many of the side passages will be blocked off and each level will be more linear. It's during those replays that the protagonists have additional abilities unlocked, which can open up a variety of different passageways, secrets, and upgrades, while simultaneously adding some character and depth not present previously. Almost each map has a completely different alternate path, transforming the previously played location to an all-new stage. Each boss is also an old-fashioned pattern recognition type of fight, though latter bosses will require increasingly good reflexes and instincts in order to avoid damage and survive. Should one of the sisters die, that boss will have some of their health bar missing, but the player will also need to resurrect their fallen sister. So long as both sisters do not die, you can continue to challenge the boss without expending any extra lives, and each repeat boss fight, in the second or third iteration of the stage, will be remixed and made more challenging so as to keep each skirmish interesting. Really, the combat and obstacle courses are the reason to keep coming back. While the mechanics are simple, there are a variety of uses to each tool and ability not just in combat, but in traversal, allowing the player to unlock alternate pathways, secrets, and even sequence-breaking shortcuts. It's an imperfect game with some mild frustrations here and there, particularly having to go through every phase of the final boss fight again should you die, but it has a solid, old-school feel that is fun to pick up and play anytime. Now if only it had online co-op in addition to local. 9 Years of Shadows is more Metroid than Vania, and I was kind of surprised to see a lot of criticism of it online. It seemed most gripes were with the game's linearity and lack of difficulty, which has me wondering how many players now use Hollow Knight as their baseline for the genre, instead of the Metroid or Castlevania franchises. While it's not the best new entry of its type, I'd say 9 Years of Shadows does a solid job of capturing the Game Boy Advance feel of the genre's evolution. The gorgeous pixel art and wonderful score will no doubt grab most players' attention first, though its elevator monologues evoked memories of Metroid Fusion for me. Perhaps that's even the whole reason it gives me that Game Boy Advance feel. However, I also think it's in that challenging enough but not too challenging difficulty. You don't really get health pickups in 9 Years of Shadow, instead needing to heal by hugging your little teddy bear. However, this little animation can leave you vulnerable, so you can't just hug and heal anytime. Your health also acts as your energy gauge, energy which you lose with special ranged attacks necessary for unlocking certain passages, defeating specific enemies, or dealing major damage to bosses. This means that the player must not only conserve energy as health, but to survive against their strongest opponents. Fortunately, you can restore health energy by attacking enemies as well, and boss phases are designed to accommodate this aspect of the mechanic, so you always have energy for destroying their little crystal barriers or weak spots. Nonetheless, it makes for an interesting risk-reward system regarding when to time your healing, assuming you have the opportunity at all. If there were any flaw with it as a Metroidvania, and where I also feel the Metroid Fusion influence kicks in, is that every region of the map is somewhat standalone. While you can connect the different sections together, they each act closer to an isolated level that you progress through linearly. You won't need to crisscross and backtrack through them often. While relying too heavily on backtracking can simply pad the game out, I think the magic of a Metroidvania is in constructing a map that you get to thoroughly explore, unlock the secrets of, and uncover new traits or hidden passages inside previously thought to be familiar territory. 9 Years of Shadow doesn't really have that, but each section is also far more littered with obstacle courses and unique puzzles than you typically get within the genre. This doesn't mean it's a bad Metroidvania, but it's certainly trying to do its own thing. For players that aren't regularly challenging themselves with Souls-likes or Hollow Knight DLC, then 9 Years of Shadow will probably be plenty challenging, and many of its combat scenarios, puzzles, enemies, and obstacle courses are more than engaging and enjoyable enough that it's bound to be someone's new favorite. I certainly like it enough to know I'll be returning, and I imagine plenty of others will be having a grand old time as it continues to hit new platforms. Gravity Circuit, meanwhile, is perhaps what everyone was hoping Mighty No. 9 would be. A successor series to Mega Man experimenting with and evolving the inspiration's design, forging a unique identity of its own. The most obvious differentiator is the emphasis on melee combat rather than blasters and projectiles, forcing the player to get up close and personal in order to bash apart and defeat their opponents. However, the grapple chain also does a lot of heavy lifting, allowing the player to yank distant enemies towards them and either pummel them to bits or use them as a projectile, or grabbing a bomb or rocket fired by an opponent only to chuck it right back. Once you get used to the game's movement and mechanics, combat becomes a dance of grappling, pummeling into overkill, and chucking enemies only to grab the debris left to toss towards the next foe. The different circuits that act as robot masters are a blast, each having high-speed patterns that, even after learning, require quick thinking and reflexes to avoid devastating attacks and capitalize on brief vulnerability windows. One of the better deviations, compared to early Mega Man games at least, as I haven't really played many following the original Mega Man X, is the ability to tackle any stage in any order. Wait a minute, Ramble, hasn't that always been how Mega Man works? Yes, but unlike Mega Man, the different boss circuits don't have specific weaknesses to other boss circuit abilities, not which deal bonus damage at least. These abilities are themselves special attacks purchased and then equipped based on the player's preference, with the player limited to equipping 4 at any time. This and other upgrade chips allow players to customize for specific situations or playstyles, with my only gripe being the inability to save and swap specific loadouts. At the very least, you'll want 3 loadouts, one for regular combat, one for boss fights, and one for obstacle courses. Typically, any replay of a Mega Man game is focused on an optimized route in which the player tackles the bosses in a specific order, utilizing weaknesses and weapon exploits. With Gravity Circuit, the replay value comes from figuring out your own optimized route based on your playstyle, and which combat abilities you find most valuable, meaning in which the best order to tackle each stage could differ from another player's as opposed to relying on the same order as everyone else once the boss vulnerabilities have been discovered. While some maps are certainly easier than others, some tougher bosses may offer abilities that have a greater appeal based on your skill level or preferred fighting style. I enjoyed it as much as Mega Man X, which remains my favorite entry in the franchise. So if you're a fan of Capcom's classic Blue Bomber, then you owe it to yourself to give Gravity Circuit a whirl.
You will now engage in a dinosaur combat test.
Technically, Exoprimal is a pretty good game. The mechanics are certainly solid with a variety of classes that each play differently, yet all fill a valuable role on the battlefield. Being able to swap out exosuits allows for dynamic playstyles during a series of skirmishes that could change and evolve at any time, closing up weaknesses and vulnerabilities while rewarding intelligent, quick-thinking play. The gunplay feels good, fighting hordes of dinosaurs is a fun spectacle, and the PvP element can inject a heightened challenge in case raptor swarms start getting tedious. Except it doesn't really work that well in execution. Firstly, there's a lot of teammates that don't seem to grasp their role. Healers trying to fight dinosaurs rather than, heal. Or, my favorite, all the melee-focused Zephyr players that think they're playing Dynasty Warriors, charging far beyond their teammates, most significantly the healers, and dying surrounded by hostile dinosaurs, unable to even be revived unless the tank wakes up and provides cover. Assuming there even is a tank and not a bunch of other Zephyrs and machine gun-toting Deadeyes. Now that's just standard for team-based multiplayer games, and Capcom had tried their best to reward playing different classes, but you can't prevent players from making bad choices. Nah, the real issue with Exoprimal is that they must have looked at that Destiny PowerPoint regarding under-delivery and took it to heart, because content is drip-fed to players at an agonizingly slow pace. What's more, even if you've made enough progress to unlock new dinosaurs in game modes, the likelihood of being match-made into such maps is dependent on the progress of other players you're teaming up with. With such a slow content drip, few players stick around long enough to regularly get to such high-level matches, which means the majority of your time will be spent doing the same entry-level activities since you first booted the game up. Really, however, the core problem isn't the mechanics or even the horde-focused matches, it's that these all feel like bonus game modes to a larger game. Though there's a story, it's delivered piecemeal and mostly through audio recordings by characters that are okay, with no real campaign mode, single player or co-op, to traverse through. This is all because Exoprimal is clearly designed to be a live service first, and while it offers players rewards at a pretty fast pace even without a battle pass, it is still relying heavily on constant player engagement and the dopamine drip feed of new skins and emotes in order to keep players returning. It's a shame, because games like Babylon's Fall and Marvel's Avengers had significant mechanical problems that prevented them from being particularly enjoyable. Exoprimal might be the first live service I've played since Destiny, whose mechanics are polished smooth and fine-tuned for maximum enjoyment, but there's just not enough meat on this bone to chew on. Exoprimal is trying to sell itself for $60 with nothing but a glorified Gambit mode, a mode that players have even grown exhausted of in Destiny. It doesn't even have the maps and replayability of Left 4 Dead, a co-op game from over 10 years ago that shipped with 4 campaign maps for both co-op and versus play, and allowed the player to select their own difficulty level for replayability and mastery. Everything about Exoprimal as a package is just destined for failure, which sucks because otherwise the mechanics and design of the exosuits and dinosaurs are great. It's a great game trapped in a bad business decision. Which is why it's no surprise I only played it for a few weeks before getting sucked into Remnant from the Ashes and its newly released sequel, Remnant 2. The first Remnant was a bit rough around the edges, especially as 2 of its worlds are giving me Vietnam-style flashbacks to the infamous library level in Halo Combat Evolved. To an extent, the continual progression down procedurally generated hallways fending off hordes of foes remains, but both enemy design and level design have seen a drastic improvement in this year's sequel. Some of the worlds are still a bit dreary to wander, but there's a lot more here to sink your teeth into, especially in terms of narrative. Playing with a friend is also precisely the co-op experience I've been craving since my Destiny Fireteam fell apart. Remnant is frequently challenging, bosses are often a puzzle, and we customize our builds and tweak our gear to work with one another and accommodate each other's strengths and weaknesses. We've also replayed a number of worlds going back and forth between one another's campaigns, and are frequently surprised at some of the new content we continue to discover. Which isn't to oversell just how unique each playthrough will be. I definitely think the marketing and fanbase over-exaggerate just how different each re-roll of a world is, especially considering how many dungeons we've played as often as 3 separate times. Yes, it's procedurally generated, but it's using a lot of pre-rendered mix-and-match blocks modularly, and there's a lot of quests and portions of map that you just get to see over and over again. However, that only makes the moments where we experience something new all the more special, and we'll even spend a lot of time studying the new environment or exploring the lore clues and narrative implications. The game can work as a solitary experience, and if you really want to absorb the story and lore, it might be recommended to do so. Reaching as far back as Gunfire Games' Chronos Before the Ashes, Remnant 2 is not only full of unique new worlds with their own in-depth histories to explore, but calls back to heroes from the prior 2 games to further develop an ongoing, long-term story about the fight against the Root. The single player is just bound to feel more challenging and even more repetitive due to those hordes of foes, though it is not impossible to tackle. The real strength is in the fascinating fusion of Souls-like and co-op shooter, where prominent Souls-like YouTubers like Iron Pineapple even yearn for a From Software co-op experience that works this well. Players will need to learn boss attack patterns, figure out dodge timings, and customize gear and builds for different bosses in order to progress. But there's just as much MMO raid boss or Destiny in this design as there is Dark Souls. The guns feel good, the powers usually feel satisfying, weapon mods and uniquely designed firearms can feel empowering, and when you have multiple players, these sprawling maps can be something players can spread out and explore together, or get into trouble and die by failing to stick together. It's a shame that Remnant 2 is as niche as it is, and is unlikely to draw the attention it should from bigger publishers or even studios. This should be your model for perpetually online co-op games. Deep lore, solid combat mechanics, and a challenge worth pursuing over and over with the promise of substantial expansions down the line. No live service, no microtransactions, no loot boxes, just a solid game that players will want to replay and encourage their friends to jump into. Instead, Warner Bros. Interactive has decided everything's going to be live service, and Sony is still moving forward with their 12 cannibalistic trend-chasing titles, while Destiny's community is abandoning ship save for the diest of hards, and all hype for Suicide Squad completely deflates while a funeral pyre is prepared for Rocksteady Games. What an industry. I wasn't actually sure I'd have much to say of Like a Dragon Ishin. I mean, it's another Yakuza game. If you've played a Yakuza game, then you know what to expect with a Yakuza game, right? However, I feel like that undersells Ishin's ability to stand alone as its own story and experience. Yes, the side quests can be as outlandish and silly as you'd expect, though after playing 7 other games by this studio, I've started to accurately predict some of their outcomes. Similarly, the brawler combat is serviceable without being excellent. It certainly does better than its other remastered brethren from the PlayStation 3 era, but the variety of fighting styles kind of become obsolete when you realize how broken the Wind Dancer stance is. It may deal less damage than the other 3 stances, but you move fast, have the most responsive and reliable dodge ability, and can even cause the average fodder to flinch with almost every strike. The default swordsman stance is probably most enjoyable for one-on-one duels, but in a pinch, it's still all about the Wind Dancer, though Gunslinger also has its terribly broken uses. On the one hand, it feels like late game bosses and fights rank lower on the BS meter than in other Yakuza games of the era, but this is also in part due to the card system that summons troops which unleash powerful abilities or support buffs. More specifically, the Pay to Win card DLC that you can get, which are more powerful than any card you collect in the base game. But whatever, you get to summon a bear in the middle of a fight. This franchise is amazing. I'd say the most significant mechanical inclusions are actually the Harvest Moon Stardew Valley minigames, wherein you collect money through farming, fishing, cooking, and shipping the collected product off to various customers. In addition to earning some serious cash, you can also receive some precious materials used for upgrading your gear. You can also collect such materials by completing missions in the game's dungeons, where you basically just go through some slapped-together caverns to fight bandits of increasing power and strength, earning experience, money, and loot which can be used to then upgrade your weaponry. In traditional Japanese game design fashion, this cavern becomes more difficult than anything in the main game, and before you even complete it, you can upgrade your arsenal to greatly overpower any opponent in the main story, which is probably why Ishin's late game and bosses are less of a pain than its other PS3 era brethren. So what's so significant about Like a Dragon Ishin? It sounds fine enough, but from a mechanical perspective, it doesn't do enough to be more than an interesting take on the standard Yakuza formula. While the farming simulation was perhaps my favorite side distraction in the franchise, it's hardly worth writing home about. But it's the time period that is so incredibly well utilized in the story this game tells. It is at the end of the Edo period, when Japan had ended its isolationist policy due to the appearance of the black ships of Western nations upon its shores. During this period, there is a political divide between the pro-imperial Ishin Shishi and the shogunate-backed Shinsengumi, whose conflict fuels the overall plot of the game. The protagonist is based upon real-life, low-ranked samurai Sakamoto Ryoma, who had also gone under the alias of Saitani Umetaro as he fought against the Shinsengumi. While Like a Dragon Ishin takes liberties in regards to Sakamoto's motivations and life events, as well as plenty of other aspects of the historical record, it heavily dug into this era and this figure in order to construct a narrative driven by division and dual identity. This was a major time of uncertainty for Japan, where the old ways were being threatened by the culture and wealth of foreign governments, and therefore the very identity of Japan as a nation was in question. Just as our protagonist lives two lives in search for his own meaning and philosophy, so too is the nation itself. As the plot unravels, it turns out that there's division and dual identities in the Shinsengumi itself, as well as each individual character. On the surface, Like a Dragon Ishin is just a silly fan service alternate history that recasts some of your favorite Yakuza characters into a different time period. And yeah, it's fun to see who they cast as who, and how those personalities get to be interpreted, but developer Ryuga Kotoko Studio didn't have to go this hard with the narrative. Because it is standalone, unlike most of the other Yakuza games, it's also the most easily replayable for the story. This makes Like a Dragon Ishin a great starting point if you ever wanted to know what the big deal was with this franchise. Sure, many of the fan service elements might go over your head, but the story transcends that gimmick into being one of the better narratives this year. And I mean cross-media, this is one of the better stories I've experienced in 2023. If you've never played a Yakuza game before, then Ishin is a great place to start.
An otaku is a guy like me who likes Japanimation.
Fire Emblem Engage? More like Fire Emblem Indulge, am I right? After the passable writing of Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, and the pretty good writing of Fire Emblem Three Houses, it's incredibly disappointing that Fire Emblem Engage would swap back to the awful fanfiction and doujin bait of Fire Emblem Fates. Shallow characters defined by 2 or 3 really stupid characteristics or quirks. These support conversations range from a literal fan club for the protagonist, to watching characters while they sleep, to singing the praises of pickles. It's as if trying to craft characters with depth seemed like it may be too much for budding young doujin artists just looking to make comiket manga where Chloe gets plowed by fellow people watcher Lewis. This is particularly frustrating as Fire Emblem Three Houses actually wove its various characters' backstories into the setting's lore, factions, and political situation. Certain houses had grudges against other houses, characters felt pressure to live up to their bloodline's reputation, others sought to abandon their preordained noble's path, and others still were commoners, just doing their best to carve a decent life out for themselves. The support conversations actually possessed depth because the characters were actually characters. So for Engage to return to this awful, shallow writing... well. Despite my complaints, there are some supports that actually provide some real character to these characters, as rare as they are. Count your blessings, right? Ideally, Nintendo and Intelligent Systems would combine their A and B Fire Emblem teams into one. Or just keep involving Koei Tecmo because Three Houses is the writing and lore standard they should always be shooting for now. Really though, Fire Emblem can't be an assembly line product anymore, despite how Nintendo seems to be treating it. Each entry ought to stand alone, and if you only have one Fire Emblem game per platform, then that's fine. But while Three Houses had good writing, it did not have the best mechanics. It wasn't a bad tactical RPG, but it was far more simple and easy than other entries in the franchise. It was, mediocre. Engage, on the other hand, is mechanically solid, exploring unique mechanics and later combining them on nearly each map. What is perhaps the best improvement for the franchise, however, is the Emblem system itself. Rather than continue with the awkward and silly progeny systems from Awakening and Fates to customize and generate unique units, Fire Emblem Engage allows you to collect and equip heroes from prior Fire Emblem games in order to learn and customize your units with new skills, including ones their class might not otherwise have. There's some crunchy mechanical opportunities here for munchkins that like breaking systems or min-maxing them, while being simple enough for chumps like me to still feel like you're taking advantage of the system. This is one of the reasons it's Fire Emblem Indulge, by the way, this masturbatory self-love of its own legacy. I'd take them to task for including several additional emblems behind DLC, but these are honestly some excellent fun battles for a reasonable price. It's still kinda pay to win though, given you get experience, money, and emblems that boost your power and help make portions of the main campaign easier. But this can be significantly offset by playing on a higher difficulty. Mechanically, this is probably one of the best Fire Emblems in recent memory, though I myself have only been playing since Awakening, so I can't speak for the series as a whole. However, with a combination of some of Three Houses' social mechanics and other systems, I feel like they could benefit with streamlining this series rather than doing the typical Nintendo "what's our next gimmick" thing. Perhaps instead of emblems, they should just take these inheritable attributes and tie them into the already existing support system. Really though, I just want Nintendo to focus on the next Fire Emblem being the best possible Fire Emblem it could be for their next console, even if that means it's the only Fire Emblem on that next console. Fat chance of that happening though.
I will do it with my spear and magic helmet.
Your spear and magic helmet?
Spear and magic helmet.
Magic helmet?
Magic helmet.
You might not be able to tell, given the playtime of everything else I played this year, but Theatrhythm Final Barline is one of my top 5 of 2023, possibly even top 3. However, I've also been a big fan since the very first was released on the Nintendo 3DS over 10 years ago. This is one of those rare pick up and play franchises I can turn to anytime I want to play something, regardless of how little or how much time I have available, and regardless of my mood. Ever since the announcement of the Nintendo Switch, I had been waiting for a new entry in the franchise, and I was beyond excited when Final Barline was finally revealed. Perhaps what works best about the Theatrhythm series is the meta mechanics surrounding the rhythm game itself. The primary draw is, of course, following the button prompts in time with classic Final Fantasy tracks and some fresh new arrangements, enjoying some of the industry's best tunes through the decades while testing timing and reflexes. With 3 or 4 difficulties to choose from per song, you can find just the right level of challenge to tackle for yourself. But, true to the series from which it draws, Theatrhythm is also an RPG, or at least partially so. Each character has a number of special abilities they can learn, activated either at specific points in a music stage or when specific kinds of notes are correctly struck by the player. This results in a bit of a metagame and building just the right party to succeed, especially when tackling higher difficulties or attempting to complete sub-objectives. In order to unlock the different songs to play freely, the player must progress through each individual game and complete a series of stages, progressing forward when a song is complete. Upon reaching the end, all songs for that game are unlocked and available to freely be played. Each of these stages, however, comes complete with a sub-objective. Completing these sub-objectives can provide rewards, be it collectible cards that can enhance the base stats of specific characters, healing items that can be equipped before entering a stage, or silver or golden eggs that provide experience bonuses to faster level your characters. Some of these sub-objectives are rudimentary to complete, but others will require the player to survive higher difficulties, avoid taking a certain amount of damage, or defeating a boss in a limited amount of time. These sub-objectives are where the RPG mechanics really kick in, with players able to create a variety of parties that can be suited for different kinds of objectives or enemy vulnerabilities. Additionally, they are training for the Endless World mode, where the player must complete sub-objectives in order to progress forward. Each failed sub-quest will delete one of 3 hearts, though these can be restored should a sub-objective offer it as a reward. This Endless World will be the primary time killer for most players once the series titles are complete, though mastering them will also require getting all sub-objectives available. In other words, while the actual rhythm game mechanics of Theatrhythm are excellent, it's the meta aspect and sub-objectives that really make it worth replaying over and over. A sort of carrot to chase and pursue, encouraging the player to consider new builds for each character and party, and goals to reach in order to complete every task. They are the excuse to keep coming back. Admittedly, I still prefer the quest mode of Curtain Call, and wish Endless World were more of an evolution of that than the seemingly simplified, streamlined version we got. Nonetheless, this is one of my favorite franchises, and I am glad to have a new entry on Switch to keep playing going forward. It is also available on PS4 and PS5, though Square Enix has held it hostage from Xbox, and clearly is keeping this franchise from PC to prevent their song files from being cracked and the base game being modded. After all, they get money from offering non-Final Fantasy music as DLC, and why pay for DLC if fans will build their own soundtracks for you to download via mods? I think this is a mistake, as the majority of community members would be willing to pay for professionally made DLC, while celebrating the availability of fan-made tracks for games outside of Square Enix's catalog, but even that is a legal minefield that could open Square Enix to lawsuits, so oh well. Still, if you can, I highly encourage anyone watching this to give Theatrhythm a spin. It's one of the last remaining franchises Square Enix has yet to screw up and fumble on. That wraps up the first half of 2023, save one glaring omission I'm keeping reserved for part 2. Keep an eye on the channel for when it drops, which hopefully shouldn't be too long of a wait. Until then, what were your favorite games between January and July of this year? Comment below and share your thoughts. Until then, I'll see you in part 2 of Year in Review.